Hey everyone on Facebook and from Music Direct and Music Direct in Chicago. I'm brand ambassador Bess Nuvera. Nice of you to join us this Tuesday wherever you are around the world. Also, a special shout out to our friends watching us via Facebook's Macintosh channel. We're glad to have that audience joining us for this very important conversation. If you've never heard about Music Direct before, well, this is that moment. Music Direct is a Chicago-based retailer specializing in high-performance audio. We are available through the web at musicdirect.com. If you're calling anywhere in the United States to place an order for products, including the stuff we're going to talk about today, it's a phone call away at 1-800-449-8333. We also invite you to visit us on our social media channels. So if you're a fan of everything that we do here on Facebook, you can also find out about our engagement in our community through Instagram and Twitter. While you're there at our page, be sure to sign up for our weekly Soundbites emailer. You'll find out more about Music Direct through our special products, promotions, as well as new releases. That's what makes Music Direct one of the best-known retailers in the country. And it's because of good folks like you who continue to do business with us. And for that, we are truly grateful. As you noticed, the program is called Conversations from the Listening Room. It's an extension of an already established conversation that my colleague Josh Bazar, our Senior Vice President, created just a few short months into the time that we have all been locked down. And in that time, reflections of life during this time have also allowed manufacturers and people in the creatives to sort of sit back and go, how am I doing? How are we managing through this time? And it's always great to know that everybody is still busy. But those who are still hunkered down at home, we hope you find solace in the music you play every day through your stereo equipment and the favorite records that might be lurking about in your collection. Who knows what you'll find? McIntosh Laboratories is one of the many brands that Music Direct has been carrying for several years now, and it was a great opportunity for us to be able to carry that brand. Anyone knows about McIntosh from its moments in history. If you were around when Lyndon Johnson gave one of his famous speeches, you'll know that it was being amplified through McIntosh equipment. If you're of another generation, however, you may have been at Woodstock, catching the Grateful Dead and that now famous or infamous wall of sound being amplified through McIntosh equipment. But for end users like you and I, McIntosh is best known as one of the great brands in audio, with a long history that stretches back to the 1940s, when its founders put together the iconic brand that we now know and love today. Our guest, Ken Zelen, is the kind of guy that you really want to know. Ken is, among others, the director of training for dealers who carry the McIntosh brand. Ken is a shining light in our industry when it comes to his story, his take, his understanding of McIntosh as a product line. He is someone that in his 5 decades has been able to make McIntosh a household word through his previous experience in the retail industry and in his current role at McIntosh Laboratories. He joins us now from his home near suburban Seattle. Ken, how are you?
Hello.
So, of course, we've all been hunkered down since, March. Every day seems like a blur, but we're still trying to make sure that we keep our heads and our wits on straight here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Uh, I'm a little bit north of Seattle, so we're in phase 2, I believe they call it, where the restaurants are reopening at very low capacity, but they're reopening. It was very strange to go out for dinner the other night. I almost forgot what it was like. And I'm working from home instead of traveling. Macintosh is not having me travel to at least the end of the year. And strangely enough, I'm getting more done this way than when I travel. So I'm creating training materials that can be sent all over the world. So I think I'm accomplishing more and spending less money for the company, which is always a good combination. So I think a few positive things will come out of this whole virus in the long run.
Yeah,
Um,
I,
so
I think that's great to know, and I'm certainly grateful that you continue to make sure that dealers such as ourselves at Music Direct and MusicDirect.com here in Chicago embrace the McIntosh story. Of course, Ken Zelen couldn't become a Macintosh kind of guy without a little bit of background about yourself. when we were preparing for this series and we invited everyone around, you were kind enough to send me your bio sheet. And one of the first things that went through my mind is 15, 1972.
Yeah.
I didn't get a chance to really embrace the Macintosh sound until the late 1960s, maybe even 1970s. So that would have put me at around the age of 6 or 8. And I think what I brought to the table and learning about it through you was my own personal memory of it when my father brought home his Mac 240 amp, his C22. He embraced it with a pair of Altec Lansing Valencias,
Ah,
Thorin's turntable. The rest, of course, is history, and it's now ingrained in my professional DNA every time I speak to our customers about the Macintosh story. But for you, it's different. You know, I got to know what happened to you when you first got a glimpse of a Macintosh product. What was going on in your mind just prior to that?
well, I'll actually take you back a few years earlier just for a moment. I always was intrigued with phonographs. And I had a little phonograph that had belonged to my brother, who was 9 years older than me, and it played little 78 records, little yellow 78s. And I loved that phonograph. Um, and when my sister was applying to George Washington University, we were taking the Metroliner train down to Washington so she could interview for college, which I guess they did back then. And I remember I was all fidgety, and my mother said, here's $1. Go buy a magazine. There was a magazine stand, and I looked up and I'm looking around and I see Stereo Review with a picture of a turntable on the front. And I bought it. It was 40 cents for the magazine. And that really heightened my interest in audio. Uh, when I was 15, all of a sudden this new hi-fi store opened up in town. So I told my mother a little fib. I told her I was going to go to the library. And instead, I rode my bike down to the new hi-fi store, which was Purdue Radio in West Caldwell, New Jersey. And I didn't realize how far it was. It was about 2 miles downhill, which was okay, except when I had to come home after, which was then 4 miles uphill. Um, that's another story on a one-speed bike. Uh, and I walked into Purdue Radio, and they sold all the great brands at the time. They had Macintosh, Tandberg, Bozak, Advent. They didn't have Nakamichi yet; that didn't exist. But they had all the best hi-fi, and I remember looking at the Macintosh with the gigantic blue meters and not understanding it at all because it looked so different from anything else. And then they played the system for me, and I remember being absolutely blown away. I mean, it was just like nothing I had ever heard. And I remember the customer they were playing it for. They weren't playing the system for me, being 15, it's not much of a sale possible. And I remember the name of the customer. You might say, how would I remember the name of the customer from 1972? Well, his name was Dave Casanova. So, pretty special name. And they played it, and Dave Casanova was buying his new speakers. And I hung out at that hi-fi store so much in the next few months. They eventually put me to work helping out in the service department just to get me off the sales floor.
That almost sounds like me being thrown out from an audio shop from time to time simply because I was so geeky about it back then. It was like,
Oh yeah,
get out of here,
absolutely.
walk away. But you got lucky. You were able to learn from the ground floor and at such a young age in terms of the knowledge. Do you
And
look?
what they used to always say to me is, Ken, when you go off to college, after college, if you come back and work for us, then we'll send you to Macintosh and you'll meet Gordon Gow. They always got into a deep voice when they said his name, and he basically headed up Macintosh. And it was always, you'll meet Gordon, who was like the person to meet. And Actually, I never went back to work for the store after college, but my second year of college, I wandered into a new local hi-fi store outside Boston, which was owned by a woman who ended up marrying Gordon Gow. And she and Gordon and I ran her store on weekends for 6 months. I was always in the right place at the right time. Just these things could never be repeated.
I think it's a great serendipity when you look at how that happened from reading stereo magazines almost as much as I did when magazines like High Fidelity and Stereo Review were still in circulation, and
Yep.
to be able to sit there and just drool at a bevy of equipment or the annual product guide as to what was out there and
Oh,
so forth,
yes.
and you just completely flip out at specs. I think that's just
Yep.
I think it's just
Everything
epically
was
geeky.
about the specs.
Yeah, yeah. All but you look at the gear and you listen to it, and that's so much fun. So you've obviously been on the ground floor in knowing audio. You ran a terrific business in San Francisco for many years. After all this, you think it would be time to retire or do something different, and yet your allegiance, your love, your comp, your respect for the Macintosh brand, as you just described, has now led you to the business of, as you said earlier, flying around a country, from around the country to all of the authorized dealers, or in my case, because Music Direct, of course, needed to receive McMaster's training, going straight to the factory and to straight to Binghamton to really experience the business of building a product like a Macintosh amp, processor, the whole shooting match. When that moment came to you that you wanted to be part of Macintosh, what was your feeling? Were you still as excited as you were when you were 15, or was there even more to it?
Oh, goodness. Well, the day I made the decision, I wasn't too excited. Um, Charlie Randall, who's president of Macintosh and uh, was at the time, I had my store in San Francisco, and he called up and said, "Ken, I want to meet with you." And I said, "Fine." And he flew out. But that night I got a kidney stone. So he calls up and I call him and I say, "Charlie, I have a problem. I don't think I can meet with you. I'm high on Vicodin and I'm passing a kidney stone and I'm in sweats on my stomach in my condo." And he said, "Well, it's important. I'll come to your house." So he, this is while I still own my store. So he comes to my house and he says, "The vice president of Macintosh is leaving the company. And am I interested in that job?" And I said, "Well, no, I still have my store and my store needs me, but what does the vice president do?" And he said, "We need a training program." And I said, "Well, I think I can help you out with that while I still own my store." So for about a year, I was still a store owner, and they made me director of sales training for the company. And I did regional trainings around the country. And then I decided, well, this is more interesting at this point. I've had my store for 16 years, and I sold my store and then went full time for the sales training with the company. So I had to honestly answer and say, no, I wasn't excited that first day because I had too much Vicodin in me.
That would be a huge problem. If I knew that was going to be happening and I would be interviewed for a job like that, first off, I'd be completely incoherent. I would I just like go, you can't come over. I'm sorry, Charlie.
Exactly.
I love you. I gotta go.
Right.
It definitely not a high watermark in job interviews. I
Right.
would
No,
probably
not at
say.
all.
Well, of course, you're now there, and
Yeah.
for all of us at Music Direct, we are deeply grateful. And that's because what we get out of those experiences in working with you and learning from you, as well as the rest of the team, including Charlie, who himself also oversaw a nice little factory visit when we were there at that first time, was a sense of familial, comfort in what McIntosh brings to the forefront. And when you
Yeah.
look at the long history of the line, I think that it shows in every smiling face that I saw there when I would run around. And you don't join a company and have a long working history. I think if I remember correctly, the average Macintosh employee there is nearly 2 decades, on
That
average for him or
sounds
her.
that sounds about right. The fellow who's in charge of the metal shop has been there 50 years. It's just incredible. Um, Macintosh is so different from other companies. They don't buy chassis, they buy sheet metal and they make chassis. And they don't buy face plates, they buy glass sheets and they cut it with a water jet. And they don't buy transformers, they wind transformers at the factory. So it's a real, raw parts come in and amplifiers leave, as opposed to most companies where circuit boards and chassis come in. And it would be very hard to restart a company like Macintosh today. Uh, it would probably be impossible.
Yeah, no question about that. So let's look at the history of Macintosh to move our conversation forward, if you don't mind. Let's walk through this introduction of Macintosh and tell us what, because you have a footprint in knowing Gordon Gow,
Sure.
what was the relationship between Gordon and of course Frank McIntosh like?
Well, Frank and Gordon were both engineers, which is really different than most companies. Most companies uh, start out with business people who hire engineers, but Frank and Gordon did government engineering work. So they were designing circuits, and they were involved with aerospace, and uh, they really didn't like the amplifiers that were available at the time. Now, we're not talking about amplifiers necessarily for people to use on their home hi-fi systems. Amplifiers are used in just about everything. I mean, if you're going to, GE aircraft used to use big Macintosh amplifiers to test AC motors. So amplifiers are used in many, many places. And at the time, all amplifiers performed very badly at high power. Um, they'd have about 3% distortion. And then in the bass, maybe 10% distortion. And in the treble, 20% distortion. And this was horrible. And Gordon came up with this circuit that was radically different called unity coupling, which had about 0.08% distortion at any frequency. So we're talking about just a monumental improvement. And that's when they decided it's time for us to build amplifiers ourselves. So Gordon came up with this unity coupling circuit, and Frank and Gordon started the company. And then Maurice came in. Maurice was the bean counter. He was the one who made sure that they were making money. And they formed Macintosh Lab, and they called it Lab because it really was a laboratory. And they did a lot of, still did government work and professional equipment. There's a company, Verdun, I believe was their name. They made bell ringers for churches that didn't have actual bells. They have big speakers at the top of the church, and Macintosh amplifiers were used for that, for electronic bell ringing, just all sorts of things. Frank was a fairly mellow person. Gordon was the opposite. Gordon was a very big personality. And Frank and Gordon disagreed a lot. And I think that's the best thing you can have, is when you've got two people running a company that disagree a lot. When I had my store, I always disagreed with my business partner, but we know that if we came to a decision together, it was probably the right decision. We had that push and pull, so we didn't make sudden rash decisions. Uh, Gordon, I'll give you an example. Gordon saw receivers as a huge, huge market. Fisher and Scott had come out with receivers. Circuits were getting smaller, more compact. You could put a preamp and a tuner and an amp together in one. Frank McIntosh said, absolutely no, we're not building a receiver. That's a compromise. Gordon said, this is a huge part of our business. We can really pull in some money doing this. Frank said, nope, we're not doing it. So Gordon had the engineering department design a receiver anyway. Frank found out about it, got really angry, and they finally settled by forming Mac Audio Company.
Hmm.
So a lot of people have like Mac 1900s, and they say, and I've got a Macintosh receiver. Not really a Macintosh receiver. It wasn't built by Macintosh. It was built by Mac Audio Company, which is the same darn factory and the same people. It made Frank feel better that the full Macintosh name wasn't on it, just Mac. So until Frank retired, all the receivers were called Macs, and they still are. Um, After Frank retired, they finally put the whole name on it. But Frank was very non-compromising. Gordon was equally stubborn, but he ran the business side of things. He was Mr. Sales. Uh, so Macintosh is, it was always a push and pull and a tug of war, but that was for the better, I believe, in the end.
Yeah, and I think, when we look now at the Macintosh of the 2000s, certainly under Charlie Randall's watch, is a company that is geared to show the respect and the history for these two guys, even though you could tell from your own experience here that they had to butt heads from time to time to make a point.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
the ideals of the brand continue to maintain its position, but as the company also is being seen from other eyes, it certainly is something that you want to see others also appreciate. So I think of myself here at the time when I did my history in preparation for some articles that I wrote for our news section at musicdirect.com, the moment when the recent anniversary for Woodstock took place. Okay, and in this case, the Grateful Dead uses thousands of watts, not just your typical 100
Yeah.
watt this or 40 watt per channel this, thousands of watts of Macintosh power to maintain what is now referred to as the wall of sound.
Yeah, it was 48 300-watt. I'm reading it from the Macintosh book. I have it next to me because I knew I wouldn't remember the number. 48 300-watt per channel power amps. And they were 125 pounds apiece.
Oh my god! But if I'm reading right, they were modified so that they could sustain some of the raw power that was going on there in an outdoor venue, and that was certainly a factor, I think, in a lot of the staying power for the product in general.
Yeah, well, what happened was at Woodstock, they were using tube Macintosh amplifiers, 350-watt mono amps. And they really needed modification because after traveling, the tube sockets would loosen up. And being on for long periods of time, this one little transistor would fail. Uh, the ones that were used at Woodstock needed modifications. The ones used for the wall of sound needed almost nothing done to them. The big problem with that amp was they couldn't get enough of them. Right before Woodstock, they realized they needed more amps, and they actually went to Macintosh, and Macintosh said, well, our distributors have them, and they went to every dealer on the West Coast to get more of these amplifiers. And they could survive being run at full power at any frequency 24 hours a day. The heat sinks on the transistors were the full chassis height practically, and this wide, and each one had many, many fins, and there were 8 of them inside, and fans, and it was just, I remember selling one to GE Aircraft, and they were using it to test electric motors. They put an oscillator on the input and a motor on the speaker output, and they could change the gain on the amp to change the voltage, and just amazing, almost indestructible. But it did teach Macintosh that they've got to come up with a way to get an amp that won't clip, that's not as big and heavy, because When you run out of power on an amplifier, it chops off the tops and bottoms of the wave and it clips. And that's terrible for speakers. And that's why people were buying these gigantic amplifiers. And that's what got Gordon to say to his engineering team, we need to come up with some circuit that will prevent amplifiers from clipping, because there aren't many people we're going to sell 48 2300 amps to.
That's definitely the case there with regard to that design, and of course a great history. I mean, we've watched as the years go by how much Macintosh has gotten more of its street cred and how people have really glommed over to it, myself included again. I will confess, though, there was a time for me after my father got rid of his amp, which is another story. I don't want to talk about that too much.
Okay.
In which a, a certain amount of the public, myself included, so this is my mea culpa in this conversation, started
Okay.
to see other products that were coming into our bloodstream. So we look
Yeah.
at brands like Krell, we look at other products that are out there, and I have to say to myself, well, this stuff sounds great. And then all of a sudden, I start to see Macintosh beginning to inch its way up into the social consciousness again. What are your thoughts when you look at how, and you can probably use your memories of looking at stereo magazines as much as I did to say, ooh, this one looks interesting, but is it you know any better than, say, a Macintosh and so forth? So I'm just curious, in the scale of our conversation here, how what did it take to get Macintosh back into the mindset of everyone who now loves your stuff more than ever?
Oh, well, there were two real things that got Macintosh out of the limelight for a while and then back into it. So one thing I have to say is, again, I'll go back to Gordon Gow was a big personality. And Gordon Gow did not drink the Kool-Aid of big, fancy speaker cables. For better or worse, it just wasn't his thing. He believed that you should have heavy speaker wire, but he rejected a lot of the designer speaker cables. And Gordon Gow sent one of his amplifiers to one magazine, and I think the magazine's been long gone, but I don't remember what it was. He sent an amplifier to a magazine for testing, and the magazine gave it a good review. And then when Macintosh asked for it back, they said, no, we keep the amplifiers and we sell them. That's how we make money. And Gordon Gow went through the roof. And he said, I'm never sending any amplifier to any magazine again. And that's a good way to not be very visible. So it was Gordon Gow versus the magazines. That was a little problem. Now, that all changed one day. I believe it was Radio Electronics said, Macintosh won't give us anything for testing. They won't send any magazine any piece for testing. We don't even know if these amps are any good anymore. So they went out and they bought a Macintosh amplifier and tested it. And it did not meet spec. It failed. And they called up Macintosh and said, we have one of your amps and it's failed to meet spec. And they got Gordon on the phone, and Gordon said, well, that's impossible. We test them all. It ends up, it was a used amplifier that someone had repaired improperly. So Len Feldman gets brought up to the factory, gets a tour of the factory. They see how they test everything. Macintosh agrees to send Len Feldman 2 random samples that Len picks from the warehouse of the same amp. Of course, it exceeds spec. And all of a sudden, Macintosh loves Len Feldman, and he's starting to test the product. Then they sent something to Julian Hirsch at Stereo Review. He was very honest, and they got a relationship with him. And then what happened was Gordon Gow passed away. He had a heart attack, passed away. Macintosh hired a new president, Ron Fone, and Ron was friendly with all the magazines. And Ron Fone called up Stereophile and Absolute Sound and all those fine audiophile magazines, and would you like to test our product? And so that was really half the story. It was Gordon was not fond of the magazines, so the magazines would have trouble being too fond of Gordon. And Ron Fone is a person who everyone loves, except unless you cook with a lot of garlic, because Ron Fone can't stand the smell of garlic. The
Garlic,
other
huh?
half of the
Yeah,
story,
great.
if I'm
Garlic.
not getting too long winded, but Macintosh amps were not high current amps. So Macintosh used output transformers. So you hook up an 8 ohm speaker to the 8 ohm tap, it works perfectly. You hook up a 4 ohm speaker to the 4 ohm tap, it works perfectly. 2 ohm speaker to the 2 ohm tap, it works perfectly. But around this time that you're referring to, all these new exotic speakers started coming out. Remember Apogee speakers and the big Infinity speakers. And a lot of these speakers had crazy impedance curves. They were rated for 4 ohms and they would dip down to 2 ohms. And they required an amplifier that could deliver high current. Well, Gordon's feeling was if you're rating the speaker for 4 ohms and it goes down to 2 ohms, you've designed your speaker wrong. So he refused to build a high current amplifier for many years. And all the high end magazines were wanting to test it with these exotic speakers. And finally, they gave in, and the Mac came up with an amp called the 7200. And that was the first high current Macintosh amp. And the press loved it. It was a great amp. It had twice as many output transistors in it. It didn't have output transformers, which was a Macintosh trademark feature, but it did have high current. And then the next amp they came out with was the 7300, and that had output transformers and high current, and it could satisfy both the new audiophile who wanted an amp that could run these difficult to drive speakers, and yet it had all the traditional Macintosh features. And that was the big turning point, was the 7300. It had the tradition with the high current. Uh, so, you know, some people will say this, Mac made some product in this in between time that they feel wasn't state of the art. Well, it was super state of the art in certain respects, but it didn't do things that a few people wanted. Ron Fone believed in building a product that would try to satisfy everyone. Don't take a political stand.
Yeah, that's always an important thing. So if given given the rise, from the phoenix of sorts
Yes,
for Macintosh, I have to ask you a question here, and this may seem personal, but I just want to sort of throw it out there at you.
I'm ready.
I knew you would. what what is the most distinctive element of Macintosh that makes it stand out? I mean, we've
Yep.
talked a number of things from a technical standpoint, but I'm the kind of person who loves form follows function. So when I look at a Macintosh, I look at its iconic glass face,
Right.
its beautiful appearance. Then I harken back to the days when my dad had his equipment with the then wood cabinets, uh, and how it from an aesthetic standpoint it was always there for you. But we also know from its performance and so many other things, the Macintosh product is one of the most indestructible, most durable products that's currently available on the market. But it's got to have a reason why it stands out from being an audiophile level product. I mean, do you see it from your knowledge of its tradition? Do you look at it from from the longevity of the brand and the technological standards that it's going through? what do you think is there in that conversation?
Well, I think the most significant, if I were to put one word on what makes Macintosh different, is it's a totally honest product. Let me explain what I mean by that. Years ago, when an amplifier, well, there's one, they're not around. I think I can use their name. Sylvania came out with a console stereo in the 1970s that had 1,000 watt power label on it. That's pretty powerful. I think it was 1,000 watts, instantaneous peak Sylvania watts, but it was a 1.7 watt amplifier in it when you actually tested it. And that's quite an exaggeration to call that 1,000 watts. So Macintosh started this clinic program years ago where they went around the country and you could bring in any amplifier and they would test it to see if it met claims. And years ago, most amplifiers never really did what the manufacturers said it would do. Macintosh, right from the beginning, their amps always did everything they said they would do. And Macintosh has always tried to have this no baloney policy. That, there's not, we don't say, call an amplifier super class A plus when it's really a class AB amplifier. Macintosh, when they need a 100-volt capacitor, they'll put in a 120-volt capacitor. Why? Because it's not working at its edge of death. You need 2 transistors, they put in 4. So Macintosh always tries to build a product that's going to do what they say it's going to do for a very, very long time. The other thing is Macintosh is very engineering driven, not marketing driven. And some people complain, Macintosh doesn't advertise enough. Well, you can't advertise a great deal and put a great deal of money into engineering at the same time. It's usually a little bit of each or a lot of one. And Macintosh is just very engineering driven. So they're always buying test equipment and new tools to help them manufacture better. It wants to be the most honest audio company in the industry. And Mac products do last a long, long time. You mentioned the glass faceplate, and I'll tell you the 2 biggest reasons why Mac uses glass faceplates. The lettering doesn't rub off of the faceplate. It's on the back. The amp's going to look new year after year. You're never going to wear through the glass. It's not going to happen. The other thing is, you can have a 1975 Macintosh MR78 tuner that you swear you're never going to give up till the day you die. And you could have a Macintosh amp from the 1980s and say, but I need all these new digital inputs. You can buy a new Mac preamp and they all match. It looks like a nice family. All your end caps are there and the knobs are similar and all of that. So Macintosh picked one way of doing it and they stick with doing it visually. Electronically, everything changes all the time.
Right.
Mac customers still like knobs, so they still put knobs on the front. But they're actually all fake. There's no switches or controls behind those knobs. It's actually being done electronically, but in a way that still feels traditional. So tradition is a very big thing at Macintosh.
Yeah, no question about it. I remember during the factory visit when they did show us the silk screening protocols for making the glass plates that go onto each piece of equipment. Gorgeous library of every model from
Yep.
whatever decade to the present. And then you mentioned about earlier in the program, you mentioned about how everything's done virtually, literally from scratch. So I get to see the chrome plating. I get to see, individual bench testing of each product, even the way that the boxes are created from the stuffing material right down to the bracing, because these
Oh, yeah.
amplifiers, as you mentioned earlier, these require a little bit of lifting, and for
Oh
those of us
yeah.
of a certain age who want to break an L1 or L2 lifting a 50 to 80 pound amplifier, please don't be my guest.
And
It's
got to make sure these things are designed to withstand shipping.
Yeah.
There's, I'll try to keep this short, but I think it's a fun story. Macintosh used to design an amplifier and then send it to California and back a couple of times, and then open it up and see if anything loosened up before they begin production. Because you just never know what can come loose. And someone years ago said to Macintosh, "You don't have to do this. You just buy a shaker table." And they're like, "What's a shaker table?" "It's this table that you strap the unit in its box to, and it's got a knob, and you turn the knob and you leave it overnight, and it simulates being shipped by UPS back and forth 5 times." They're like, "Oh, great." So they order a shaker table. It gets delivered to the warehouse, which is near the service department. They had just finished fixing a Mac 1900 receiver for a customer. They were bench testing it. They said, "Well, let's test it with the 1900s." They set the Mac 1900 receiver on it. This is around 1973. And they strap it on the table, and it's got this knob from 0 to 10, and they don't know where to set it. Let's set it to 5. They turn it on to 5 and set it to go for 12 hours. And they come back the next morning, and it's turned itself into a Heathkit. It's now a million parts on the floor.
Oops.
Yeah, you don't set it for 5. You set the table for 2 for an amplifier.
Sure.
Set it to 5 for cinder blocks, apparently.
Yeah.
That they had to give the customer a brand new receiver. So,
Ouch.
yep, Macintosh does everything for a reason.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. But again, as you've wonderfully stated, I think that it's a product that, despite that destructiveness, is still the kind of product that people, including myself, still continue to aspire for. I'll tell you a
Yeah,
little story on my end. Um, Once we started carrying the brand at Music Direct and musicdirect.com, one of the first things I needed to do was reacquaint myself with it. And thanks in part to your brilliant training and everyone over there at Macintosh, I now have my resurrection, as it were, in appreciating Macintosh more than ever. So among the things that I've had to do prior to the lockdown, as it were, is I'd be in our office in Chicago. And as many of our customers may or may not know, we built 2 very state of the art listening rooms for our customers to visit when they're in Chicago. And one of the things that I've had to do in my lifetime with the company is to set up equipment either for demonstrations by my other colleagues or sales team, or myself for another guest who would be coming in, or for visits like you to make sure that your gear is ready to go. So comes the time for me to break out a Mac 7200 receiver. And I'm like, outside of the fact that I had to call a colleague from our warehouse and go, "Could you kind of lift this for me, please?"
right.
And put it inside the rack. What happens next is a journey of reinvention and happiness. Since that time, every time I've had to do a speaker evaluation, every time I've had to check sources, every time I've had to do something, the very first piece that I generally walk into in one of those rooms will be that Macintosh. Will be that
Right.
point where I'm going, all right, let's see how it does with this DAC. Let's see how it does with this other stuff. Because you want to be able to have the ability to say, Macintosh isn't just a one size fits all kind of company. Or product. It's the kind of product that, despite what people do to look at other amplifiers, and as you've said before, you work tirelessly to give it the Macintosh sound, and to be able to give it the flexibility to work with DACs that are out there, from Blue Sound streamers to turntables from brands as synonymous as yours and even ours under MoFi Electronics. You really get that feeling that a Macintosh product is a proud piece of equipment for someone to own. But the
Yes.
technology, as you've stated, has really has really been, the thing that always has me loving Macintosh more and more as I enjoy decades more of my profession, and more so as a person who, after hours, I'll sit in the office and listen to the equipment, and then I get this phone call from my wife saying, "Come home, honey, dinner." And I love
Where
her.
are you?
I love her. It's always that kind of a feel good in the end. And again, that's a testament to your team in Binghamton and all the people from around the world who are cherished lovers of Macintosh equipment, and certainly for our customers here in Chicago and around the United States who have ordered their products through Music Direct and MusicDirect.com. On that note, let's talk about the Mac 7200. Okay, so I mean, we talked about the fact that it was on its start as a company that built its reputation on making products that were virtually no compromise. You saw that in the relationship between Gordon and Frank. Now comes the 21st century, and we have to be able to keep that magic going. And I think
Yep.
the 7200 is a solid state design. Okay,
Right.
you invariably have to look at the history of Macintosh, and you think about tubes, you think about a solid state, and you're still making both categories, which is great.
Right.
Okay, but why are they loving the 7200 more than ever? Why is this one piece solution, complete with DAC, the whole shooting match? Why is everybody gravitating toward this piece?
Well, it gets you into the club. Now, you're probably wondering what the club is.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I don't recall getting a membership card in this conversation.
No,
I don't
no,
understand.
no, there's no membership card, and I guess I'm the president of the club. So, you know, when you go to buy, well, let me back up just a moment. Amps can last a long, long time. I mean, if someone said to you, I have a McIntosh MC275 amp that I bought in 1968, and I don't need to play louder, I just feel technology probably is advanced. What do you recommend for a new amplifier? Well, Mac 275. Here's an amplifier that the company has made for 50 years and it's still state of the art in tubes. So amplifiers do improve, but speakers seem to be improving at a faster pace. I will admit that. We're now using computers to design speakers. So now they can take a computer and add half a gram of weight to the front or the back of the tweeter dome, and the computer will simulate how the tweeter dome is going to react physically. And we're just really learning to do that. So speakers keep getting better at a relatively fast pace. But whenever you're listening to a speaker and auditioning it, really the first question the salesperson should ask the consumer is, what amplifier do you have? Because certain amplifiers do well into 8-ohm speakers, and certain amps do well into 4-ohm speakers, and a very few amps do well into 2-ohm speakers. And a lot of speakers dip down to 2 ohms now. So a Mac 7200 is an interesting thing. If someone is shopping for a new pair of speakers, and the salesman says, before I show you speakers, tell me about what amplifier you have. Well, I have a Mac 7200. It has 200 watts per channel. Well, that's enough to drive any loudspeaker ever made. It peaks at almost 400 a channel. That's enough for any speaker. It has power guard, which no other brand has, which means it cannot clip. The chopping off of the top and bottom of the wave can't happen with a Macintosh. It has a patented circuit to prevent that. Okay, what impedance is best for the amp? It actually has connections for 8-ohm speakers and 4-ohm speakers and 2-ohm speakers. You can hook up any impedance speaker. What happens if you buy a speaker that can't handle the full power? Well, it's got accurate meters on the front, so you can see how much power is coming out of it. So if a customer says to you, I've got a Mac 7200, they can buy any loudspeaker in your store and know they get the full benefit of it. That's what joining the club is. You might choose to upgrade your amp at a later date, but you won't need to. And it's the Mac 7200 is the least expensive Mac amp that gets you into the club. So the rules are you have to have power guards so your amp can't clip. You have to have meters so you can see how much power is coming out. And you have to have autoformers so you can use any impedance speaker. And if you have those three things, you're in the club, and you probably never really have to buy a new amplifier. Now, the one thing that's happened is all new amps have DACs built in, and DACs are computers, and computers keep improving every few years. And McIntosh wrestled with that. So on the new generation of integrated amps and that Mac 7200, the digital section is on a plug-in circuit card. So you loosen two screws on the back and it slides out and you remove a connector. And when technology improves, or when people need a new digital feature that doesn't exist today, Macintosh will be able to have a new digital module. And that's how Macintosh has gotten around the obsolescence of the digital section, because they really want you to be able to keep that amp for a long time. I was at one of our very nice dealers in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, and this fellow comes in, who knows, maybe he's listening to us now. And I recognized his voice, and I yelled out, Dr. Schwartz, I recognize your voice. And he yells out, well, who's that? And I said, it's Ken Zelen. I sold you your Mac amp in 1977. And he says, you couldn't possibly remember that. And I walked over and shook his hand. And I remember I sold him a BIC record changer with a Stanton cartridge and Macintosh ML1 speakers, and the first Mac amp with 200 watts meters and power guard and autoformers. And I said, what are you here for? And he said, I'm buying new speakers. I've gone through 5 pairs of speakers since you've sold me my system. And I said, really, have you bought a new amplifier? And he had this startled look. He says, well, no, I bought your first amp with that thing so it doesn't chop the way. I said, yeah, it has power guard. And he says, and it's got the things with the ohms on the back. I said, yeah, it's got autoformers. And he said, do I need a new amplifier? No, you've been in the club since the 70s. And he's like, oh, good, because I only want to buy speakers today. So
well, I guess I renewed my membership as a result of this conversation based on that.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So being in the club is really important. And 7200 gets you in the club. I mean, there's not a speaker in the world that I know of that it can't drive. And I think that's why people love it. It's the least expensive Mac that has almost everything Macintosh knows to put in an amplifier, and the best digital section we can do today, but with upgradability when things get better, because we know in 10 years the digital section will be completely archaic. We'll be up to 12 gigabits, and we'll be in the gigahertz range or something, and we'll be streaming everything.
Yeah, but you're still going to play a record, man. At least it's got a photo stage on board. Come on, for the rest of humanity.
We're streaming all our digital sound.
Yes. Well, look, brace yourself, brother. We're out of time. we burned a good hour together, and
that's what happens when you call someone who's from the East Coast and Jewish.
Oh, murder. All right. Ken Zelen, McIntosh, thank you. You have been a total star, and I am thrilled to have seen you virtually. I do look forward to seeing you in the real world when we can all get on a plane or frankly, at this point, I'll be happy to drive up through some of the great highways of America to Washington State again. I love Seattle, and I certainly love that area. So it'd be great to see you
And I love
when things get.
Chicago, having lived there for 2.5 years.
That's right. I
Just
forgot
not in
about
the
that.
middle of winter.
In the middle of winter.
Not in the middle of winter.
Not in the middle
Not
of winter.
doing that.
Snowbird. Great. Okay. Ken Zelen, thank you very much. Thursday, excuse me, on our Facebook channel here at Music Direct and musicdirect.com, you will want to join us for a very special conversation with Brad Lundy. He is the president of Lone Mountain Audio, and he is the U.S. distributor for one of the most iconic loudspeakers in the world today, ATC loudspeakers. If you know of their work in the recording studio, you're certainly going to love the story of how they work out as a product in your home. He'll also bring us up to date on how things are going in his world since the start of the madness so many months ago. For all of us at Music Direct, thanks for watching. For our friends watching on McIntosh's channel on YouTube and on Facebook, thanks for being here. Remember, if you've missed any of this live deal, we will rebroadcast it on YouTube, and it'll stay there for a little while, so be sure to check it out. And as always, if you're interested in any products we offer at Music Direct from McIntosh and all the brands we support, we're a phone call away if you're in the United States at 1-800-449-8333 or online at musicdirect.com. Like us on our social media pages, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.